In this video, we're going to go over some basic misunderstandings of how the brain works and clarify how it actually works. These are popularly known as neuromyths. The first is about how the human brain is not actually a processing center, and that our brains are actually much more holistic. Imagine you're calling into a customer service center and you have, option one for emotions, option two for memories, option three for vision. That's a popular misunderstanding of how our brains work. All of the brain does everything at the same time. A good example of how this works is with memory. The hippocampus is popularly understood as the brain's library where memories are stored, but that's actually not how it works. It's more like a switching point, redirecting information throughout other areas of the brain. Similarly, we think about the occipital lobe as responsible for vision, but really you need all of your brain functioning in order to do vision, because what you see is dependent on understandings of the world around you and the memories you have of what you're looking at and the way in which you're regulating other brain processes. Similarly, we see that memory is regulated and processed in other areas of the brain too, not just the hippocampus. So, for example, we have procedural or motor memories controlled by the cerebellum, and that's where we get the idea that it's like riding a bike, you never forget it. And then emotional memories, especially ones regarding fear and anger, are associated with activity in the amygdala. Neuromyth number 2 concerns how brain processes are discrete, and the truth is that they're much more interconnected than that. And we know this based on the high correlations between brain processes that we would normally consider different from each other. For example, if we look at emotions, we tend to think about pride and joy and serenity as these different things, and anger and sadness and fear as these different things. But really, if we look at the correlations between those emotional experiences, they're actually quite high. And that means we can't necessarily separate them into different or discrete processes. They're much more intertwined and interdependent than that. Myth number 3 concerns how there is no real executive control command center that oversees everything. In other words, there's not this central base for conscious experience that regulates all of the other brain processes. Sometimes in popular culture, there's this depiction of a tiny person inside the brain that's managing other brain processes, and this is definitely not how it works. All of the brain functions we have are, if you want to think of them as something like socially interactive, then they're very egalitarian. There's no brain process that controls all the other ones. Next, we have the idea that brain activity is always causing other types of bodily functions or behaviors, and this is essentially an error that involves conflating correlation and causation. We know that some brain activity does, in fact, cause or regulate other functions throughout the body and our behavior, but some of it is actually just reporting back to us so that we can understand what's happening. And this is why we should not confuse brain imaging research that involves correlations as necessarily identifying an underlying causal mechanism. Sometimes that's true, but not always. And finally, our last neuromyth involves the brain activity somehow always more so focused on what's happening right now in the present and processing information that we're getting in the current moment. Most brain activity actually involves simulations for past or possible future events. That is to say, most of the time, what our brain is doing is working on information that we have gotten from past experiences or that we might encounter into the future. Again, that's not to say that we're never focused on what we're consuming now in terms of information in the current moment, but that tends to be a minority of brain processes. Some neuroscientists have connected this with our tendency towards dissatisfaction with life, and that essentially a lot of our suffering can be attributed to the fact that we're constantly thinking about past and future events rather than being in the present. Some neuroscientists would even connect this with a mindfulness approach to well-being and say that essentially redirecting our mental focus to the current moment would make us happier, and there is some evidence for that as well.